네, 안녕하십니까.
Welcome back, and we are now ready to start session 3-1 on the topic Hallyu phenomenon and research. This session will be moderated by Professor Woo Mi-sung, a professor of theater and drama, East Asian cultural studies, and contemporary Korean studies in the Department of English Language and Literature at Yonsei University, and also the director of the Institute of East and West Studies. Professor Woo, you have the floor.
Okay, welcome back to session 3, subsession 1, Hallyu phenomenon and research. Hallyu, the Korean wave, is the hottest topic indeed in the field of Korean studies and even today's meeting. But the increase in global popularity of Korean popular culture may not always be good news to researchers of Korean studies. It creates a lot of interesting momentum, but at the same time, there are new challenges. So we will discuss those issues in this session. And 4 presenters here represent 4 different regions. Professor Seok from South Korea, Professor Park Ji-min from Asian countries, Professor Choi Jin-hee from Europe, and Professor Jin Dal-yong from North America. But their discussion may not be limited to those regions. Each presenter will talk about 15 minutes, and I'll try to minimize my comments in between presentations so we can save more time for discussion at the end. The first presenter, Dr. Seok, is a professor of communication at Seoul National University, and she will talk about what kind of turning point or momentum Hallyu brings to the Korean studies.
안녕하세요.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen. I am Seok, professor of communication at Seoul National University. So it is a great pleasure to join the Global Korean Studies Forum with prominent scholars. Thank you very much for the invitation. I do know that the speakers will be talking about Hallyu, or the Hallyu phenomenon. So I'd like to now talk about how Hallyu phenomenon can impact positively research in Korean studies. I think that there were some concerns on this very topic, and I wasn't exactly sure whether my presentation would be appropriate for this session, but I think that maybe it can actually provoke some thoughts and discussions. So maybe I made the right choice. So how can Hallyu contribute to Korean studies? This is a question that we had in our minds for a very long period of time. So let us try to find an answer to that. From 2000 to 2013, I was a professor of Department of Information of Communication Sciences at the University of Bordeaux, and basically I'm a professor of communication belonging to the social sciences, and from 2013 and onwards I've been working or teaching at Seoul National University. So I've been going back and forth between these countries, and I can say that my Hallyu experience is closely connected with this trajectory as research and educator. When I was professor at Bordeaux, I was a professor in the Department of Information and Communication Sciences, as I've already mentioned. And as you know, it was the Department of Information and Communication Sciences, so I did not have to teach anything about Korea. In 2000 to 2013, Korea's existence was not much different from any other countries. And there was no pressure that I felt from the students that I needed to teach Korean pop culture. And Korean language education at the University of Bordeaux, which did not have a Korean department, was only provided in the form of university language classes, not majors, between Chinese and Japanese. It was at AXE in 2010 when I put together a media session, and at that time the members of AXE wondered why this was a session that was a part of Korean studies. But there were many young scholars and students in that media session, I remember. in 2010 and 2011, especially when SM had its Paris concert, it's true that we've been seeing the overseas influence of Korean pop culture that was not as explicit before, but now was increasing through internet and digital culture. If you look at the University of Bordeaux, we do see students, without any Korean students, putting together Korean culture clubs, and that just explicitly shows that there is a heightened interest and demand for Korean culture. And rather, my opportunity to invest my expertise in Korean pop culture was after joining Seoul National University in the KF Global E-School program. Since 2015, I've been teaching French, Vietnamese, and German students on Korean Wave or Hallyu and the Korean pop culture. And through the Seoul National University Gyeong Summer School, I've been teaching the relevant scholars on this very topic. And the Department of Korean Language Education was established at the University of Bordeaux in collaboration with Seoul National University, but you can see that it was quite belated. There were many students that were already awaiting for the establishment of the Department of Korean Language. And in the meantime, they've actually registered with the Department of Japanese or Chinese Studies, and that they have been waiting until this department on Korean language was established. And at that time, my classes had to do with under the influence of Japan and the US, how it actually achieved such cultural power and how it was able to overcome all of these challenges. So K-pop, K-drama, or any Hallyu with research that was underway in 2000 wasn't the focus of my course. It was on the roots of Hallyu. So Hallyu refers to the popularity of Korean pop culture abroad. So in other words, Hallyu is not equal to Korean pop culture. In other words, it's about Korean pop culture itself. Well, this is not Korean pop culture itself. In other words, although it may be popular in Korea, it may not be as popular abroad because Hallyu is a contextualized acceptance phenomenon, and it may not be that influential in foreign countries. So in that aspect, media culture is important. K-beauty, K-fashion, and you can see that we're seeing heightened interest in all fronts. But all of this actually had to do with the media culture itself that made it more compelling. So Hallyu phenomenon is something that cannot be separated from media culture. So changes in the media environment and circumstances is a key component to Hallyu, and all of the policies, angles to Hallyu need to take this into account. However, if you look at Hallyu and pop culture and media culture, seems to be intertwined, and sometimes there is no distinction, and there's a confusion among Hallyu, Korean pop culture, and media culture, leading to various academic inconsistencies and politically incorrect results. So I believe that it's important to reflect upon the specific opportunities, risking tasks, and how to use the special opportunity brought about Hallyu as an opportunity to develop Korean studies going forward. And it would be my perspective as an expert on Hallyu and pop culture and media culture on this very challenge.
한국 대중문화의 성공은
So in the early 2000s, the success of Korean pop culture was a success story heard from abroad in the early 2000s, but now it's been a flow, trend, or phenomenon rather than just an individual one-off case. So we and the Hallyu scholars can say for sure that this is not just a fad. Originally, the scholars were not able to understand this. We weren't exactly sure why foreigners really liked our pop culture. So you can see that maybe we were undermining our culture at that time. There were local Hallyu reports that we found astonishing, and scholars started to look into acceptance studies to understand the context of why these contents were so popular at the time. So Daejanggeum and Winter Sonata were some of the topics that were studied to understand its popularity. And with K-pop's influence growing stronger, there were numerous reports from overseas pouring out about the competitive Korean cultural industry, and it did criticize the unethical situations of the trainers of K-pop and human rights violations and the excessive competition in the K-pop industry. So it was a Western perspective in K-pop. However, Parasite won awards from film festivals in Europe and North America in 2019. PTS had multiple Billboard record highs. In 2021, Squid Game became the most watched series in Netflix. And then foreign media started to look at Korea's culture with a different view. So it was about how Korea was able to produce such good contents. And you can see that this phenomenon was something that could not be understood by just a techno-orientalist framework. Whether it be Parasite or Squid Game, you can see that there was a lot of analysis going into this, and you can see that there was a lot of Korean text that actually self-criticized such pop culture. So you can see that this was a different type of angle. It's you really need to be mature to be able to criticize your own culture. So there was a lot of in-depth articles that wrote about the development of Korean pop culture, but most of the Western newspapers had to focus on just a handful of journalistic English texts written in the early 2000s. And these Western media seemed to create some sort of orthodoxy about this popularity or wave. So their focus was that since the 90s, the civilian government recognized the importance of the industrial potential of pop culture. So ever since the Asian financial crisis, decided to really focus on pop culture, and then all of a sudden, like a big bang, started to hone this popularity and decided to export this culture. And what we're seeing now is the product of such export. So there is some variations to that, but this is basically the gist. The budget for the government in the Korean industry increased every year, and the Ministry of Culture and Sports and Tourism, the Korea Creative Contents Agency, was established during the Lee Myung-bak and Park Geun-hye administration. And during this period, there were all sorts of cultural campaigns prominent overseas. And of course, it also adds that there were a lot of government-led promotions of Hallyu, in addition to investment in production and exports. But then, if you think about unprecedented assessment that investment in culture yields results, particularly exports and popularity abroad. Does this make sense? I mean, this has no grounds. This claim is basically groundless. So it seems like at that time, it was just a closed circuit of some English text at the time, government policy announcement, and early articles going back and forth, and just within that closed circuit, not necessarily having any facts or grounds to base their argument. And you can see that reporters and critics who are cultural experts reproduced this and did not doubt that this belief that went against their expertise in the dynamics of cultural field actually did not make sense. And the Orientalism acted in that it could recognize the technological and economic success of young advanced countries outside of developing countries, but not their cultural capabilities. So basically, I believe that the approach was Orientalism here, of just noting the economic success, but not its cultural capabilities. If you look at Psy's Gangnam Style, it showed the power of spreadable media, that Korea's media culture can spread around the world without the will of overseas propagation. And BTS also utilized, as a third-generation K-pop idol, various social media channels to let them be known. And you can see that from 2012 to 14, we've been seeing Korean dramas increase, and there were all sorts of papers on this. So from 2016, you can see that I ended my dissertation in 2016, so I don't have an additional jotted line here. But from 2014 and onwards, you can see that it was an upward trending. And I think that this the impact came from Psy's Gangnam Style back then. So what you saw was journals or papers in Korean, and this is a graph on the papers in English. So what we can say here is that ever since 2014 and onwards, this increase in articles. From 2016, well, I do have to mention that BTS has decorated the headlines back then. So there was a lot of research, many articles on Hallyu, and you can see this angle, a sharp increase in this research. So if I do engage in this research once again, I think that we can maybe further focus on the media industry, and that it's not just about K-pop or K-drama. I think maybe Hallyu may not encompass this concept anymore. I think it could be another brand new phenomenon. And the reason why there was this structural problem with Hallyu research was because it was based off of unprofessional early text on Hallyu, and also the excessive use of Hallyu in public relations by the government, but particularly because there's a knowledge gap on Korean pop culture. The formation of pop culture in Korea, where modernization began under the threat of imperialism from great powers, is inseparable from the history of Korean modernization under the influence of the United States and Japan. So you can see that during economic growth, we had to work long hours, but film and television was a key leisure activity of Koreans. And if you look at the pop culture and form, it actually was based on a close interaction with its audience. And there was high quality knowledge and papers on Korean pop culture, but it was all in Korean, so it was only read by Korean scholars. And you really need to have high proficiency in Korean in order to understand it or read these dissertations. And as for the foreign scholars that cannot read this paper, it necessarily led to a knowledge gap on Korean pop culture. So in the year 2000 and onwards, with many of these scholars that did not have a full understanding of Korean pop culture, it led to huge knowledge gaps. So then, this knowledge gap, you may think we can just close the gap. Why is this an issue? But it is an issue because you can see that it eventually disparages Korea's cultural capabilities in constantly reproducing this ungrounded discourse. It leads to a misunderstanding on Korea's modernity, and it goes through this reproduction, which of course undermines the status of Korea in cultural diplomacy. And if this is not corrected, the image of Korea would be that it lacks cultural capabilities, even though it can succeed in technology and economy. So this can actually be the shackles of Korea going forward. So if history, language, culture, and bettering the understanding on all of these fronts is enough, well, that would be different. But if it has to do with finding a way to raise the prominence of Korea, I think that as we see the Hallyu increase, we really need to correct this misunderstanding. And if we do not, it will become a hindrance in bringing up and enhancing the overall cultural capabilities of Korea. So I've actually made inquiries to many overseas universities, and you can see that there's a demand for really relevant courses on Hallyu and pop culture, but we were also able to understand that there wasn't enough text or literature on the true aspects of pop culture of Korea. So I really think that we need to put in some further efforts to maybe have text papers in English to better the understanding of scholars. And if you may allow me, I'd like to use just one last minute for my conclusion. So then, how can we utilize this opportunity offered by Hallyu to find a way to sustain Korean studies? You can see that there's an explosive increase in the number of students who want to learn Korea, and I believe that Korean language and understanding Korea actually is beneficial. And I think that this is a critical element. It's not just about K-pop that actually led them to Korean studies. But then, of course, some was impacted by Hallyu. But you can see that this is exceptional. You can see that most of area studies have to do with a dynamics. And the former that I've mentioned actually was the key dynamics. And the revival of Korean studies after the 2000s actually had that dynamics and added to that Hallyu, which helped it gain traction. But I think that it's not about which actually was greater. It was about the synergy between the two. You can see that the Hallyu led to have more people learn Korean. So the audience that came in via pop culture or media and the interest of these, how would that have a positive impact on Korean studies is, I think, that the question at hand. So I always ask these questions. The interest in Korea, if it starts off with interest in Korean history and Korean literature, then we can call this grand or noble. But if it starts off with K-pop, is it shallow? If we do get to understand the tombs of Goryeo era or Confucianist philosophy or Korean syntax or Hong Gil-dong biography, that's noble. But if we gain interest in the Korean family systems, human relations, modern Korean economy, and competition through Korean dramas, movies, K-pop, and BTS, is that less noble? So I think that maybe we've been trapped in certain occupations or premises. And this March the 3rd, and it was self-organized, by the way, for the two occasions. But the third BTS Global Interdisciplinary Conference was held amongst the BTS global fans. But you can see that their focus is a little bit different from Korean studies. They focus on social issues, climate change, and also human rights. And BTS fandom, through their network, talk about what they have been doing to solve these social issues. So this is different from Korean studies. But can we say that this is completely irrelevant from Korean studies? So the public communicating, interacting with BTS, learning the Korean language, and creating a new fandom culture. What kind of relationship does this have with the interest of Korean studies? And I think that maybe this could be one good possibility where overseas Korean studies can be connected with universal values beyond the identity of minorities. You can see that based on the interest in Korean pop culture, you may go to study at a department of Korean studies, but then if this leads to a scholarly interest in Korean language and Korean history and society, what kind of education and support would be necessary to really enable this path? I believe that the goal of overseas Korean studies ultimately to form a self-sustaining research and education system to produce scholars or to educate a large number of pro-Korean citizens with advanced knowledge and a friendly attitude towards Korea. So I just thrown in multiple questions. So I would like to conclude my talk with one analogy. K-drama as method was the lecture that I made or gave at the Seoul National University's Gyeong Summer School, and it was very well received by the students. And I wanted to mention what kind of impact would pop culture have on Korean studies, and I think that we've been able to see a positive opportunity. As mentioned, Korean pop culture was formed in the process of close interaction with industry and the public. So the most intimate desires of hopes, frustrations, anxiety, fears, and joys of the Korean society permeate into genres. And I believe that journalism or communication does not regard pop culture as a means of attracting the university population to another research subject, but rather as its own research subject. So I believe that this should be not just a means, but it in itself is a key area of research. This is a product of the political, economic, cultural, and artistic sensibility and imagination of the Korean society. And you can see that the dramas, pop culture includes all of the sensibilities. And pop culture is a method for understanding contemporary Korea, and it's an attractive research topic. And Hallyu is a sociological and an international relations opportunity with the partnering country. The Hallyu of Russia or Japan or Egypt, wherever it may be, it's about the sociological dynamics between these countries. And because Hallyu in itself is not Korean pop culture, so I would like to understand that it's about a relationship. And we need to understand this in order to find the right relationship between Hallyu and Korean studies. So Hallyu and Korean pop culture are evidence of Korea's cultural influence, but at the same time can make Korean studies very enjoyable for all of the scholars, as it already does. So the future of enjoyable and spontaneous work is much brighter than otherwise. And with that, let me conclude my talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hong. Her career moved from Bordeaux University in France to Seoul National University gave her really interesting, unique transnational perspective, and she proposed a couple. She posed a couple of really interesting questions. Is Hallyu the result of state's operation? That's very, heavy question that we should discuss. And she's also posing another issue. There is popular misconception that popular culture studies is not scholarly enough. Is it true? So we'll come back to that issue at the end of the discussion. Okay, next presenter, Dr. Park Jimin is Associate Professor at the University of Malaya, Malaysia. He will propose a new direction for Hallyu research. The main title of his presentation is From Push Out to Pull In Strategies. Professor Park?
네, 안녕하십니까. 말레이시아
Good day, I am Park Jimin from the University of Malaya in Malaysia. When I give lectures, I often receive the question about Jimin Park of BTS, but not today. So just as Professor Hong, I spent 10 years in France, and in January this year, I moved to the University of Malaya in Malaysia. And in France, when I was searching for jobs, I submitted applications to the US and European universities, and sometimes I reached the final stage of the interview. Sometimes I did not, and at the final interview, I was asked that I am not a Korean studies scholar, because Hallyu is the topic of my thesis and an area of research for me. And in many cases, universities did not consider Hallyu as a legitimate research field. But in the University of Malaya, they thought differently. They thought that the Hallyu is a very important discipline and that I am a full Korean studies scholar. So in the past 10 years, as I was looking for a job, I came to wonder, what is the issue with Hallyu that I cannot find such a job? And as has been mentioned earlier, for a non-Korean person, Hallyu reflects the economy, culture, society, history of Korea in an interdisciplinary manner. And as the 8KS was established, the perspective changed that Korea should drive forward the development of Korean studies, and Korean studies became more of a national studies. And so Korean studies, seen from the national and government perspective, was used as a means to disseminate the positive side of Korea, to raise Korea's national image. And as this was intermingled with those who studied the literature, language, and some more traditional disciplines of Korean studies developed into the form of Korean literature studies, folk culture studies, and history and politics studies. And so Hallyu, I think, became the subject of a wide perception that Hallyu is not a full and fledged discipline. And this is not just one country, but in France and in many other countries, there are 300 plus students graduating from Korean departments around the world. And yes, humanities was the basis for such growth of Korean studies abroad, but for Korean studies to become so popular and to produce almost 300 students a year is very much thanks to Hallyu, and we must take stock of that. But what's important, as I felt while studying to Korean studies students in France, they started to learn about Korea because of Hallyu, but then they came across the literature of the Three Kingdoms dynasty, the ancient Joseon dynasty, and so forth. And their expectation and what they're actually learning, there's a huge gap in between. And many of the students do not pursue an academic career. Many of the students move on to other job careers. And in this case, just because they speak Korean and they know the Korean history and literature does not help their lives practically. So in France, after just a single year of Korean studies, 300 students are cut in half. They leave to other departments. And Japanese or Chinese majors sometimes graduate and then are readmitted to Korean studies departments. So the demand for Korean studies and what is actually taught, there's a huge gap. As you can see in the table, I looked at the distribution of faculty across different disciplines in Korean studies, and as you can see, most of them are teaching sociology or history. And there are no room to hire Hallyu researchers. And job openings would describe new culture and all types of culture of Korea, but it is actually very much biased towards language, history, and traditional literature faculty. And so, as I said earlier, although the department starts the year with 300 students, only a few remain. And are there faculty that are capable of providing sufficient education? And can these faculty members instruct paper writing? But to them, Korean studies is about history, about folk culture and language and literature. And what's also interesting is that in France, history is very important. And in a single lecture, a Korean studies professor was mentioning how great the Taedong-Yeoujido is, but one student pointed out that even before 1861, steam engine was made and there was a world atlas that was already developed back in the 16th century, and the Europeans ventured into the Americas and other parts of the world. And so Korean scholars only focus on the development of Korea, and they are just so obsessed with the pride of Korea as a nation. And that points to a very wrong direction that Korean studies is headed. And it's not just a matter here in Korea, but among Hallyu researchers, we also see the same. So in Korean studies, of course, Hallyu receives much spotlight. But by studying Hallyu, we need to also bridge over to other disciplines. Based on my experience when I was studying Hallyu in France, I was asked, what can Europe do but to use Hallyu to expand user base for Netflix? I was asked to conduct a research project. But we need to do more of comparative studies, but we are only geared towards Hallyu. Some believe that Korea has a great traditional culture and that's why Hallyu is so popular. But that's not really the case for non-Koreans. Some believe that Hallyu is very much growing because of democratization, but one student said that no, that's not the right approach to study Hallyu in our country. So the Hallyu is so different in different countries. And some mention cultural hybridization. And some say that yes, Korean culture is globalized, but so are other cultures. You cannot point to hybridization of culture as the reason why Hallyu is so popular. And some believe that in the early days, Hallyu was only popular among the East Asian nations and thought that Hallyu can only sweep across like-minded countries and countries that have cultural similarities. But now Hallyu is sweeping across the world, so that theory is not very valid. So we need a comparative study, and we need to be aware of implications for other regions. For example, what I am doing in Malaysia is what is wrong with the film institute policies in Malaysia by comparing those with that of Korea. So this means that rather than trying to explain Hallyu out of the Korean perspective, we need to focus more on what different regions and countries want and like about Hallyu. So let me briefly conclude. For Korean studies to become sustainable, we need to bridge the gap of supply and demand in Korean studies. First, we need to identify the supply and demand. And KF cannot provide support forever. If Korean studies is important in a particular country, that country itself will voluntarily provide support. But if that is not the case in other countries, Korean studies may lose the platform for exchanges, and that is why they are more reliant on KF support. And secondly, in conducting Hallyu research, we need to move out of the Korean perspective. We need to push out Hallyu, stressing why Hallyu is important. For instance, economy and business scholars that are practically non-Korean studies scholars received 5 years of support in looking at Hallyu, and that's how Hallyu research came to develop so much. And this was a very good and popular topic, and for me it was a great learning opportunity. And so for Korea, how to define Korean studies and how to utilize Korean studies as a means to meet our national interests should be pondered on. And also, we need to think about how each different countries and what each different countries can gain from Hallyu. And I think this can be an interesting topic of research going forward for Hallyu. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Park. He talked about his own first-hand experience of being in job market, so I can really empathize with that. There's definite imbalance between pre-modernist and contemporary Hallyu studies scholars. So, you know, the Hallyu, this trend of Korean wave seems to create illusion that contemporary Korean studies scholars are doing better and thriving, but actually that's not true. So we will have to talk about that issue at the end. Thank you again, Professor Park. Next presenter, Dr. Choi Jin-hee, is reader of film studies at King's College, London. She will talk about Korean studies from film studies perspective.
안녕하세요. 저는 최진이라고 하고요. 영국에서.
Hello, everyone. I'm from the UK, and I wanted to particularly extend my gratitude to President Kun Lee, who I think just stepped outside. But thank you very much to all KF, and let me now begin my presentation. I prepared my presentation in English.
So I'm going to talk about film studies. I've never been in Korean studies, and I started teaching Korean cinema only 3 years ago. And I got my PhD in film studies, specializing in Korean cinema in 2004, and my monograph came out in 2010. So after like 15 or 16 years, and then I just started teaching Korean cinema, in part because I think, like as Professor mentioned, there wasn't enough, I think, scholarly sources to assign readings for films. And I didn't want to just kind of pick a few Korean well-known male directors and just study them. And so I was waiting. And so it was more like a bottom-up. So there's a student demand, ongoing demand, and then I was, no, not yet. And then I just started teaching Korean cinema 3 years ago. And I don't know, fortunately, unfortunately, I'm not going to teach it in the coming year because I became the head of the department. So I have a teaching release. But I got hired at King's College in 2011, and I worked elsewhere before. And I became the chair of the department, and I'm the first ethnic minority who became the chair in film studies. And so, but I don't think it was because of Korean film popularity. I think it's my achievement. But anywho, so there's a coincidence in terms of the kind of rise of significance of Korean culture in the UK and abroad, and then also the kind of transformation of film studies as well. So I'm going to talk about positionality, and then various platforms that help to disseminate Korean culture, including cinema and music and such. And then from a student's point of view, what are the things that they want from Korean cinema class, and then some cultural impacts in the UK specifically. So I'm going to, some presenters already mentioned positionality, but how do we define positionality? And this is a definition from Cha Beng-hwa, a Singaporean scholar, and he talks about positionality in terms of location of production, distribution, consumption, and exhibition. And so where it is made and who distributed. So for example, some of the Korean films are distributed by Studio Canal, European really largest distribution investment company. So there's a kind of change in terms of like, CJ distributes in Korea versus it gets distributed by the UK or European distributor and such. And so location should be taken into consideration in studying the kind of this rise of interest in Korean cinema as well. And I would say that positionality of not just the products, but also scholars and students. So what kind of background do you have? And he has this kind of interesting idea of intensity of self-investment. How much do you want to invest? Do you want to watch YouTubes all the time? Do you want to, so Korean culture can become a gateway to extend your knowledge and deepen your knowledge, or am I just going to listen to Korean music and then watch Netflix because of pandemic. I have several international students in class, and I was making jokes, I can watch 10 episodes over the weekend, and I had to do it with Squid Game because everyone asking me about it. So, okay, I'll dedicate myself to Squid Game for one weekend and watched all of the episodes. And then I said, but Korean television series is usually about 16 up to 20 episodes, and I cannot do that in one weekend. And one student raised her hand and, that's called dedication. she can watch all of them in one go. And so investment from student perspective and scholars, and also I think to do with language as well. I think in the UK, at least, scholars who are interested in Korean cinema do not command Korean language that well. There are only few who can speak Korean. So I think different perspectives, but also in a way it's an investment to me at least. So I guess what is popular cinema? I think that's another question to raise. And popular cinema is not the same as commercial cinema. Commercial cinema can be a popular cinema, but not the only form. And so what are the ways in which we can study popular cinema? I think that's the kind of question to raise as well, like pop culture, Korean wave, and such. So this is basically demand from market, popular cinema. And some films can get popular, like Nobody Knows, for example, Koreada's film, was not a popular film, but because of the social issues, a lot of people saw the film. But rest of Koreada's films are not really popular in Japan, as far as I know. And so there is a kind of intersection between popular cinema and then commercial cinema and such. But how can we study those? I think that's the question to raise. And some of the kind of angles that we can bring in is obviously industry, and also the kind of commercial genre, and taste, aesthetic, and stardom. I think stardom plays a big role. A lot of fans of Gyeong in my class. And so I think that there's quite a bit of study in industry, including Professor Jin's work. And so I think there are many layers of mediations to study cultural text. But what I find a little bit limiting and frustrating is that there's this kind of desire and expectation to link directly from film text or films and social political context, and then skip the rest. So like genre, generic conventions, or industry. I think industry is very important, but people just kind of dismiss it. And then there's expectation for me to read something Korean out of Korean films. And not every Korean film is about Korea. It does register certain aspects of it, but it's not about military dictatorship and such. And so as a scholar, and also when I teach courses, I emphasize all the mediations and how that can transform, even if it's a kind of adaptation of the, real life incidents and such. What is the aesthetic transformation that's taking place, rather than, oh, this is the serial killing from Hwasong, like in Memories of Murder and such. So I think both as a scholar, but also as someone who's interested in Korean culture, all these mediations, I think, and then that's where the notion of location comes in. And where does it made, and then did it get made, and then how is being circulated and such. So all this kind of mediation is very important, I think. So what is the Korean cinema now in the field? And then this is a kind of a controversial claim, but it's born in 1919, and then was it had a 100th anniversary. Because even when did Korean cinema begin? If you think about a film, where is it? It's a cinema that was first built. There are different ways to think about the beginning of Korean cinema, but still focusing on director and then films, and then kind of eliminating the context, so to speak. But conventionally, people say it's 1919, and then it's over 100 years and such. And some of the various platforms that Korean cinema is available is obviously festivals. And then I think YouTube's Korean Classic channel is really big help for teaching purposes. And Korean Film Archive, I just recently discovered that they made a lot of films just streaming for free if you go to Korean movie database. So I've seen like tons of like 70-some films from the 70s. So if you can command Korean, you can still study Korean film abroad. And so it's a great platform for a scholar like me. And then Korean Film Council, obviously. So people, kind of valorize Parasite, but I think it was a kind of time to acknowledge both commercial industry and then the kind of artwork. So I think that's why Pong got all the awards. And then Parasite became an art text for many students in my class. Everything I said, oh, that's in Parasite. Parasite. So cute. But some of the things that I was involved in the UK, not only like big festivals like British Film, BFI, International Film Festival, and Korean Culture Center also was running festival over 10 years, but some more kind of diversified platforms, such as like Queer East, and I did the introduction for Moonlit Winter, it's Yunhiege, a kind of queer film, and also they are continuing the program. I also recommended A Distant Place, 아주 먼 곳, so another queer films and such. So there's a kind of not only just commercial cinema, but I think kind of diverse interest in Korean cinema, and there's a kind of invitation for me to introduce this kind of films. And then, other presenters already mentioned online platforms such as Netflix and BFI Player and Curzon, I think. Oh, I was approached to Twitter about Peninsula by Studio Canal when they're releasing Peninsula as a DVD and Blu-ray in the UK. And because I used to be a fan of Kang Dong-won, I said I would do it. So I had to tweet. And so distributors approach scholars to promote the kind of products that are going to circulate, so kind of create a discourse. That's another marketing strategy for distributors as well. So, because I have only 1 minute left, as I mentioned, I just taught Korean cinema for the last 3 years, and I used to teach Korean cinema as part of Asian popular cinema. And so our department is a little bit odd. We have 3 East Asian cinema specialists, and then 2 of them are Chinese cinema specialists. So I kind of try not to overlap. But so I teach Asian cinema by genre, so A Better Tomorrow, Gyeong and then Stray Dog, Kurosawa's film, and PTU, Johnny To's film, Hong Kong film, and then Memories of Murders. 4 of them are crime film that I teach together. And rather than teach them individually, but how they are in conversation within the region, and also they transform the conventions of crime film genre and such. And then family drama, Ohio, Ozu's film, Nobody Knows. And I'm writing a book on girlhood. So the girl who leapt through time and then goes into shell as a kind of anime, and Godzilla and Train to Busan. That's how I kind of the two together, so to speak. Korean cinema, I organize differently rather than genre. I go by topic, and I don't teach chronologically. So the first 3 is about urban space. So Bittersweet Life, that's 달콤한 인생, Modern Freedom, 자유부인, Microhabitat, 소공녀. And then I kind of look at the 3 together, and then how they explore urban space, and also discuss genre and gender that way. And then these are the films about stairs. So Housemaid, Priests, and Memento Mori, the 3 together. Different genres, but it's really easy kind of motif that combine the 3, and you can talk about how each film tackles this kind of modernity and such in a different way. Last bit is, of course, trauma. So Peppermint Candy and Murmuring series, a documentary together. And the last one is I usually go for reply series, and then either Hong Sang-soo and such. But in terms of diversity and inclusion, not just in terms of student makeup, we emphasize to show both women and men directors' film. So in Korean cinema, at least I try to, in each segment, there's one woman director's film included, in a way. And I try to stay away from films that just trying to kind of drive you to the national disaster. So many want to study House of Hummingbird, but I was kind of like trying to stay away. But Reply series I teach 1994 because there's a Seongsu Bridge. There's a Sampung collapse of Sampung and such. And so the way I design Korean cinema is that it's not chronological, but from Madame Freedom, that's 50s, and then Housemaid, that's 60s, and then Peppermint Candy, kind of like overview of Korean history, and then 90s, up until 90s. So students want to learn about Korean history as well. But I don't teach chronologically, but I say at the end, you'll be exposed to 50s, 60s, 80s, Peppermint Candy, and the 90s. And then I kind of feel it in the 70s at the moment. So I'm a kind of revisionist, so I don't teach from like Obaltan, Aimless, Build It, that kind of tradition, but kind of teach by theme. And I think it interests students more rather than like starting from like 40s and then up until contemporary cinema or just a couple of Mayo tours and such. And so if you are interested in like developing Korean cinema curriculum, I'm happy to discuss either in the discussion section or outside drinking coffee or something. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Choi. Sometimes, doing film studies, social and political contexts are even more important than the film text itself. So it requires a lot of time and energy if you are a film studies scholar. So thank you for your wonderful presentation. Next presenter, Dr. Jin Da-ryong, is distinguished Simon Fraser University professor and a global professor in the School of Media and Communication at Korea University. The title of his presentation today is Korean Wave in North America in the Past 30 Years, Prosperities and Challenges.
Okay, thanks so much. I have the English PowerPoint slide, but since I have been taking my study leave in South Korea since last September, I might use the Korean instead of the English because I'm in South Korea. 안녕하십니까.
Good afternoon. As introduced, I am Jin Da-ryong. I would like to present the past 30 years of progress of Hallyu in North America. Many people raise the question whether Hallyu can become a part of Korean studies, but if we have time, I would like to discuss that topic, and if not, I would like to continue that discussion during the wrap-up panel. But today I'd like to focus on Hallyu, or Korean Wave. Hallyu began in the late 1990s, particularly in 1998 and 9. That coincides with when I studied in the US. I was formerly a journalist and then went over to the US to study, and that is when I started to hear the word Hallyu. So in North America, I'd like to point out to my experience and also the academic development of Hallyu in North America. So I would like to present both my personal experience and the development of the academics of Hallyu. So the first thing I came across in the US was 대장금 and the Autumn Stories programs. I learned from a fellow colleague there, and the friend left the cassette tape in front of my front door and told me to open my door, and I found the videotape actually of those drama, and myself and my wife started watching the drama, and we actually sat there and binge watched the entire program. And then I started with 대장금, and then my friends lent me the videotapes of Autumn Story. So I mentioned this because in North America, Hallyu started off with the Korean students in the US, or Korean Americans, starting in the late 1990s and early 2000s. So immigrants basically started the Hallyu. And then the second wave of Hallyu was led by the Korean media in North America, such as Korea Global channels. in big cities, and in smaller areas, the cassette or video or DVDs were lent out and rented out, and that's how Korean wave spread. And then later on, social media became more popular in size Gangnam Style and other social media types of content that spread. So social media, compared to the renting video or cassette tapes, is different in that there is no material ownership of contents, but a sharing of digital contents. And that's a different way of approaching and coming into encounterment with the Korean wave. And then there was the OTT. Squid Game, Hellbound, Our School Today were released to 199 countries across the world on the same day. So those are the 4 steps that Hallyu went through, and this is most distinctly found in North America. So as has been mentioned earlier, Korean pop culture, the popularity of Korean pop culture drew forward the Hallyu, and some believe Hallyu as an industry. But in my view, Hallyu exists where the two sides meet. So there's the development of the pop culture and popularity of Korean pop culture across the world. So these two sides must come together when we look at Hallyu. And that was the perspective I've had for Hallyu. And up until the late 2000s, Asia drove forward Hallyu, but since then, Hallyu swept across North America. And so I started my research on Hallyu, and these books are the 3 books I wrote on Hallyu. I call it my own Hallyu's trilogy. So these are the stories of Hallyu that I have written. Even though the word Hallyu is not included, digital technology books were also released about Korea, and I was able to do this work in North America because Hallyu is gaining spotlight in North America, because the academic fields are always reflective of the surrounding realistic environment. In North America, Korean culture came to spread widely thanks to the development of digital technology, and that was why I came to be able to study Hallyu in this part of the world. And of course, there are different books, but in the early days, it was not easy to understand Hallyu. And in general, Hallyu was not being understood in an organized manner. So this film was released in 1999 called Shiri. The screen on your left is the Korean poster. On the right, that is the UK poster when Shiri was released there. There is no such scene in the film. This is a fake poster, because in the UK, Korean film was not very familiar. So in order to attract more audience to come see the film, such a poster was made. And in the early days of Hallyu, as Korean culture moved beyond Asia and to other countries, there was a big barrier. And Transnational Korean Cinema was my second book, and on the right, that is the actual cover page of my book originally, featuring the actor Ha Jung-woo. But the left-hand side is the cover that I was proposed to use. And this portrays the North Korean film, not South Korean. Even university presses couldn't distinguish between South Korean and North Korean films. So that really shows the low level of understanding of Korea at the time. But since 2010, the perception of Hallyu and Korean culture in general started to change, and many students started to develop an interest in Korea and Hallyu, and they are listening to lectures, and they are writing term papers on K-pop, K-movie, games, and soft power and cultural diplomacy. Of course, at the government level as well. Going beyond the academic field, there have been many endeavors, such as the K-pop competition, which is held in Vancouver just before COVID. And this is where I live. And as a Hallyu researcher, I participated there as a jury, and I took a photo with the participants. And through all this, Korean pop culture started to gain worldwide attention through Parasite and Minari in particular. Minari was, of course, produced by a US filmmaker, but it was a joint venture with Korean and United States filmmakers. And of course, BTS requires no introduction. And recently, Squid Games gained much popularity on the K-pop culture stage. It was released through Netflix and really signified a big change in Korean wave. And during the COVID era, Hallyu played a particular role because, as you know, face-to-face contact was impossible, and online contact-less Hallyu started to gain wider base. And although this is done across the world, Korean K-pop makers and pop culture specialists really took the lead in developing such contactless content. For example, BTS or Blackpink, most notably. And this has already been mentioned by many other speakers. Recently, Korean language and Korean studies is gaining attention and popularity. This particular chart was developed by Professor Barbara from Copenhagen University. There's a continued growth in the number of Korean studies students, but there's a limited number of faculty members and spaces available for students. So that's how Hallyu is sweeping across the world in Europe and North America as well. And through the OTT platform, the digital platform, Hallyu is released and reaching the global audience on the same day. Then since we are here to discuss the future development of Hallyu and the Korean studies, in post-COVID, how can and how should Hallyu develop? Well, first of all, the contents, rather than contents removing uniquely Korean nature, we actually need to develop more uniquely Korean contents. If you look at the case of Japan, as you know, the anime, the manga, and video games were very popular across the world. But J-pop culture was quite popular in the 80s and 90s. But with Hallyu, a significant part of J-pop culture is losing popularity, particularly for the anime. And one of the key reasons was that while Japan developed its pop culture, they removed the Japanese characteristics from the contents. And the result was the contents showing no personality or characteristics. It was successful in the beginning, but in time, J-pop culture lost the momentum. And this is happening across the world. And so that means, and earlier we heard from Lee Sun-young, the PD from CJ, it's pointed out that Korean nature should be removed from the K-culture, but I beg to differ. I think that uniquely Korean characteristics must be fully reflected in the contents. And secondly, we need to deepen the transnationalization of Hallyu. We should go beyond just stressing the uniquely Koreanness of the content and create a more universal and inclusive and diverse content by working with specialists from other countries and other cultures. And thirdly, we need to make use of the digital technology. In many cases, you only think of K-pop, drama, film, webtoons, but Korean pop culture is gaining popularity, and Korean digital technology and digital games are also gaining popularity, as well as webtoons. So digital culture and pop culture should be converged and should mutually develop. Last but not least, we need to reinforce the intellectual property. As you can see in the chart, IP has become a most important source of finances in this OTT world. Squid Game gave $2.4 million to Korean producers, and Netflix took $900 million in earnings from Squid Game. So as long as we do not resolve the IP issue, Hallyu may not continue to grow. So we must secure an IP to develop K-pop culture in a smart manner. And since many of the participants has expressed their appreciation to KF, I would also like to just add that this is linked to academic development as well. This screen you see are from two different public diplomacy events on the same day. Well, almost the same day. One took place on October 5th, 2021, and another on October 4th. One took place in the US, one in Korea, but they were actually concurrently held. They addressed the same topic of public diplomacy and about Korea and US relations. I was invited to both, but I had to choose where to speak. And I wished that these two events could have been held in different on a different day so that more people could attend. And last November, there were two different events held as well. In Michigan, Reclaiming the City event was held, and another, Alone in Seoul, was held by Brown University. Again, KF sponsored both events, but concurrently. These events took place concurrently, and of course they were held online, and we couldn't go to both. So at the KF and AKS, I understand that much support is being provided. Yes, support is important, but as you hold these events and conferences, I'm not saying that you should manage and control, but I hope that you could be considerate so that as many people as possible can attend the events and make sure that the events you support do not take place concurrently. And in that way, I think we will be able to share Hallyu with a wider audience. Thank you.
네, 감사합니다. 발표자분.
Thank you very much. I thank all speakers who are speaking in English, and for the remaining of the session, we will have a free discussion. First, we would like to start by expanding what was mentioned by the speakers. The contemporary Korean studies scholars, you might guess at what the challenges are. The endless production of cultural contents, updating all the trend and catching up with the trend, and while at the same time developing the scholar's own methodology and focusing on particular issues to write analyses and teach. So there's a much heavier workload for teaching and research. So such a burden may be here for the lifetime for the contemporary scholars. So I don't think we should discuss on the challenges. But this morning, Professor Duncan said that pre-modern scholars are not really finding it easy to find jobs, but contemporary scholars, I think, also have an imbalance on the other end of the spectrum in the tenure deliberations or hiring or when applying for grants for 규장각 or KF or other organizations. Contemporary cultural researchers, I think, are losing their opportunities to win such grants or positions. And the statistics we saw now, it's true. I think that KF is investing a large amount of money for support, but most of that support goes to pre-modernists. And then students will only be able to learn the Gojoseon's Three Kingdoms period and Joseon, and nothing about contemporary Korea. So there's no way to inspire the students, and so less and less students will come to the Korean Studies department, and Korean Studies will lose the ecosystem to develop the next generation of scholars. So why don't we discuss this issue of imbalance? And the floor is open as well.
자, 지금 마이크 틀리나요?
먼저 진
네.
교수님 말씀.
Yes, Professor Chin, please.
모든 상황을 설명한다고 해서 이것이 한국학을 한 학자들에게
I don't think that explaining the modernity is really unfair for contemporary scholars because Hallyu has a wide reach and a wide range. It is not just about K-pop because K-pop is only a part of Hallyu. If you look at the industry in general, there are different aspects that Hallyu touches, including cultural policies as well. That means that Korean society, politics, culture, all that is encompassed in Hallyu. The text and dance of K-pop is a very narrow way to look at Hallyu. And secondly, when we talk about the key part of Korean studies, which is literature and history, well, in that case, what about the contents of Hallyu? Are the contents of Hallyu really connected to literature and history? What I'm trying to say is that although Hallyu started in the 90s, it is rooted in the Korean history. In the last few years, 100 years history of Korean cartoons and films were celebrated in big events. Recently, we have been studying the contemporary films and cartoons, but if you go back further into history, they are connected to the history of Korea, and in particular for webtoons. Webtoons include a massive narrative, almost equivalent to literary work. So analyzing all this can be included and connected to Korean studies, the traditional fields of Korean studies. So personally, I think that as Hallyu entered into the arena of Korean studies, I don't think that pre-modernist or contemporary scholars were treated unfairly. I think we should rather look at how to connect Hallyu with literature, traditional literature, and have an interdisciplinary cooperation.
네, 이은정 교수님.
Professor Lee and Gyeong. As I, in many cases, do take the initiative, and I think that I should be the one to break the ice, but sometimes I may be criticized for that. But here we have media experts, Finn experts. Thank you very much for all of your insightful talk, and it was quite interesting and quite significant, and it's been very helpful. But I do have a couple of comments that I would like to make. So amongst the Korean studies scholars, I think that you probably saw that we also need to respond. So taking a European perspective, Europe, I would like to say that the wave of culture they do not see in decades, but they look into every 300 years. So in the 18th, there was a Chinese wave. In the 19th, the Japanese wave. And I was waiting for the Korean wave, and now we finally do have that wave from Korea. So whether it be China or Japan, you can see that it did have a great impact on the European culture of the times. And now what we're waiting for is to have this Korean pop culture wave to have an impact on the thoughts and philosophy of the region and also join the discourse and discussions of the region. And we're waiting for that time to come. And it does take a lot of time to actually see that in fruition. So we're talking about, let's say, the Chinese wave. So from the Baroque and to the Rococo era, you can see that Chinese culture had an impact, but this was in retrospect when we looked back. And in the end of 19th century, we've seen other Japanese elements in the arts history of the times. But if you look at Hallyu, or the so-called Korean wave, I would have to say that unlike China or Japan or the wave that we've seen in the past, it's different. It's led by people. So when we analyze Hallyu, we're not exactly sure how and what kinds of angle do we need to take when we analyze Hallyu. So, for instance, we talk about K-pop, we talk about K-film, we talk about popular cinema, but if we want to take an academic approach, I think it has to do with the foreign cultural elements and how that impacted the local culture. And we need to analyze that first and compare to that what's different about Hallyu and what kind of impact will Hallyu have on the local culture. I think that's something that we need to analyze first. So that's one comment that I would like to make. And second, I believe that Professor Hong Seok-kyung, you've mentioned that in assessing Hallyu, foreign scholars believed that the government emphasizes that they focus on the push by the government. And what I also do when I look at media reports from Germany, I would pass that on to you or the professors, and many of the reporters would actually call me and ask me how much government support was offered to BTS. In 2013, the Korean wave, how was that created in the first place? And the book by Uni Hong, I think, on Hallyu has actually had an immense impact. So in the Western perspective, they believe that in the Orientalistic perspective, Korea would not be able to actually harness such cultural capability. So that was your take on that. But it's true that many Korean studies scholars have actually contributed in the process when we talk about Hallyu and when we think about disseminating Hallyu and what kind of role should the Korean government should take. I think taking this approach actually maybe trigger the conversations that you think that is going backwards. And the third point I'd like to mention is for a Korean studies scholar to actually gain a position in European universities, that this is very difficult. But because being a Korean studies scholar and making it difficult to get employed, is this the right premise? Because cultural studies, if you look at cultural studies, Korean studies is actually at the pillar. If you look at the studies, the curriculum, you can see that most of the Korean studies have a key relationship with cultural studies. But in professorships, what we have to see is how well would that person cover Korean studies, but we don't have that many resources. We just have one single professor, I myself, and we of course have 12 members of the faculty. However, there's just a limited role that the individual faculty can play. So the response that we take would be to invite Professor Hong Seok-kyung to our classes. And because now we have the platforms possible where Professor Min Hyun-jung, for instance, would come to our university and provide lectures, and then that will enable students to write their papers. So we cannot cover all aspects, but Korean studies compared to other disciplines, in order to be competitive and to be comparable with other disciplines, we really need to satisfy all of the requirements and guidelines of the academia and the universities. But just defining all that and just trying to find someone that's an expert in Hallyu could not be the way that we can take, because there are specific guidelines and protocol. And the last point I would like to make, when we do conduct surveys for students, we ask, do you want classes on Hallyu? If we ask that question, they say no, because they are, well, either K-pop fans or K-drama fans. So actually, they're even better experts than us. But they would say that they want some more information on the background behind Hallyu or the culture. So about this Hallyu phenomenon, if we want to find a way to academically enhance this discourse, we need to put in more thought. And I just want to mention that Korean studies, we cannot be attacked as such. It really is not valid from the first place. Well, I've actually received a message from the organizers that we need to wrap up, but I will give you 30 seconds each. So at the Korean Foundation, if they do hire a professorship, this was something that happened in Cambridge, and in 3 years' time, that professor would get fired. So we do understand the demands of the students, but what happens is the hiring process and the subject of study and the methodology in some cases would not be aligned. So the Korean Foundation wants to support the professorship, but what the universities would do, just take what they need and then just would ask the professor to leave, then to have the professor retire or resign. So I've never thought that I am a scholar of Korean studies, because I am a film major, and originally my major is in philosophy. So all of the degree programs are different, and I think that you've already mentioned about the job precariousness aspect, but to generalize all that, I'm not really exactly sure if that's the right angle to take. So based on our personal experience, we are trying to find a way to gain or pinpoint the common ground. So I think, well, the point here is not about whether it was right or wrong. So thank you very much for the observations, but we do want to mention that our experience is a bit different. So I think that there are some divided opinions. But yes, thank you for that. I mean, the Chinese and the Japanese wave, at that time, China was contemporary, and during the times back then, the Japanese wave was the contemporary wave. And now the Korean wave, or Hallyu, is the contemporary wave. So, of course, it may be an apples-to-apples comparison, but I did mention that Hallyu is a type of acceptance phenomenon, and the reason why I say that is because K-pop on the outskirts, it's very difficult to understand. You have to see what the fandom does with K-pop, and if you look at K-culture, I believe that it has relevance. If you think about Parasite, Bong Joon-ho thought, well, this is quite local, but then you can see that all of the directors in Europe and in other parts of the world said that, well, actually what you portrayed in Korea is what we also see in our countries. So it was the same case for BTS, and we can see the K-pop phenomenon from BTS, and I have been engaged in case study on BTS, and that's why I can say this for sure. But Korea is a advanced nation that grew from a developing nation. It went through colonial rule, it went through economic development, democratization. So all of the difficulties that Korea experienced and are being experienced by other developing nations, actually Korea has all of that experience. And we also have the humble spirit, that thirst. And in addition to that, Korea is a neoliberalistic country with a great gap between the rich and poor. And the advanced nations that have experienced this before us, of course, probably now has a band-aid on their scars. It's not like that they did not go through all this. So in that aspect, the capitalistic issues that Korea has been criticizing, I think could have actually dealt a enlightening blow to the advanced nations. It's probably the same case for Squid Game. So I want to say that Korea's culture is relatable now. This has been confirmed. So the Korean wave or the Korean style, for instance, in this contemporary world, we can call that contemporary. In the 17th, 18th century of China and Japan, it cannot be apples to apples comparison, but I want to mention that Korean style right now is truly contemporary. So as a moderator, it's very difficult to manage the time, but you can see that we have scholars that are very much interested in Korean studies, and I think that there's probably a lot to say, but of course we do have the panel discussion to follow, so I hope that we can actually engage in some further discussions afterwards. Thank you very much.
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you very much for the enthusiastic discussions, and I am very sorry that we had to conclude the session in the middle of such discussions. Please continue on with your exchanges during the final session, and I'd like to thank the moderator, Professor Wu, and all the panelists. Let's give them a round of applause.